Okay, I'm now starting the shiur. So this shiur is based on an article in the Journal of Halacha and Contemporary Society in June 2022. It's totally derivative. The title of the article was "Use of Voice-Enabled Technology on Shabbos in Emergency and Non-Emergency Situations." It was written by a doctor named Jerry Karp, who must be a young guy because he's a resident. He's a resident at Einstein in radiology, although Laser's son knows him, I think, and he's supposed to be something exceptional. A resident physician in radiation oncology at NYU. Now, the second author is Rabbi Chaim Jachter, who writes brilliant stuff. He's a rabbi in New Jersey, and he's a dayan on a Beit Din, and I think he also has a pulpit and so on. And if you look up his stuff, he's written some really brilliant stuff. So they took on the idea of there are different ways of getting speech onto a computer screen, right? In other words, or getting a message onto a computer screen. One is by typing it. So you have a keyboard, you have a computer screen, and you type in your note, right? That's the way I do it. I send emails and so on and so forth. But there's a newer form of kind of dictation where you actually just talk into a machine, and the machine somehow learns your voice, and then it puts the what you say onto the computer screen the same way as if you typed it. But of course, it's much more efficient because you don't have to sit there and type it. All you have to do is say it, and there you go, right?
Or voice to text.
What's it called?
Voice to text.
Voice to text. Okay. Now, the question is, so there have been multiple discussions about in modern halachic response about whether typing is considered prohibited on Shabbat, and of course, more or less the answer is yes. It uses electricity in many ways. Some people argue that in emergency situations, it's preferable to writing because it may not be the same as writing. It's not letters on the screen; it's just little points of light, and so on. I'm not going to talk about that, but there certainly is a prohibition of writing or keyboarding onto a screen, keyboarding a message onto a screen. The question is there a prohibition of speaking a message onto a screen? Can you Can you commit a sin with your voice? I mean, you're not using your arms. At least with keyboarding, you're using your hands. I'm just sitting here and talking. Can you commit a sin doing that? So there are models to say, yes, you can commit a sin with your voice. Particularly the one that's used as an example in the Gemara, which is source number 1, you have it, in the Gemara Bab Metzia, Daf Tzadik Amud Beit. This is talking about I'm not going to necessarily read every source, but this is talking about there's a mitzvah or not to muzzle your ox when it's on the threshing floor. So the ox in the old days used to be used to turn a machine, which caused some kind of threshing, and there would be grain that would be splattered on the floor where the ox was moving. And the Torah says you can't muzzle the ox; you have to allow him to eat. Now, what happens if you're performing that kind of action with your ox on the threshing floor, but you don't put a muzzle on the ox? Except every time the ox puts its head down to eat something from the floor, you yell at the ox. You say, Bessie, don't do it. You scream as loud as you can. Most animals will refrain from doing that. So now you have a sort of a voice-activated avera, or is it? So the Gemara says, yes, it's an avera. Chasma b'kol, v'inhiga b'kol, whether you prevent an ox from eating with your voice, or hinhiga b'kol, even if you cause the animal, you lead it with your voice. Now, when will leading an animal be a sin? So there's a halacha of kilayim for animals that you cannot plow or draw a wagon with animals of different species. You can't put, it's a mitzvah in the Torah, you can't put an ox and a donkey together to pull your plow or to pull your wagon. So you can get in the wagon and you can take a whip and you can slap the two animals that are, one's a donkey and one's an ox, and that's an avera. That's a sin. You've caused two different species of animals to pull the wagon. What if you just get up there? You don't hit the animals. You just say "giddy up," or you yell at the animals. You startle them, and they start running. So the Gemara says that's also a sin. So it does not have to be a physical action per se, using your voice to get animals to do certain things which you're not allowed to do. is the same sin. The argument is between Rabbi Yochanan and Reish Lakish whether you get lashes for such a sin. Is using your voice. Now there's a principle which is not the main point of this shiur, but there's a principle that that a sin that you perform and you do not perform an action, you do not get the punishment of lashes. It's still prohibited, but you don't get the punishment of lashes. Rabbi Yochanan says, you know what, this is you do get lashes for this. Why do you get lashes for this? So the Tosfot says that even though it's not an action, the Tosfot says, well, it's not an action when you use your voice, but it causes an action. The animal pulls its head away, or the animal pulls the wagon, right? So even something that's not an action, which causes an action, Rabbi Yochanan says you get lashes. Reish Lakish says you do not. The Shulchan Aruch in source number 2 says, it's talking about kilayim, plowing or planting or pulling a wagon. If he makes them go as one, and even if he uses his mouth, loka, even if he uses a voice command to get them to do these things, he gets lashes. But what we've seen for sure, both according to Reish Lakish and Rabbi Yochanan, is that using your voice is a medium in which to commit an avera. You can't say I didn't do anything, I just talked. There are some averot that are purely voice averot, megadev, cursing, hamir, transferring animals, transferring kedusha from one animal to another, a false, making an oath, a false oath. So there's discussions about which one get lashes, which one don't, but we know that it's an issur. Now, when it comes to electronics, I just brought in source 3 two brief excerpts from Rav Moshe Feinstein Zecher Tzadik Livracha in responsa. One is talking about tape recorders, and at the end of his discussion of tape recorders, he says, if we have some kind of machine, that with bedibur, in other words, if you're using your voice to cause a malacha on that machine, by that machine, he says it's usher, right? He talks about also using your shade to cause an action, even though it doesn't look like you're doing very much. Vaday asur lasot zeh b'Shabbat v'Yom Tov. So you can't, again, with electronics, if you somehow use your voice with electronics to cause an action, Rav Moshe said it was usher. He talks later about using of a microphone, which he prohibited. And why did he prohibit a microphone? The hadiber oseh shemechala yoter electrica, or electra. When he talks with a microphone, it consumes more electricity. And he says he's not even sure himself what the malach is, but he thinks it is. You shouldn't use a microphone. Again, you're not doing anything, you're just speaking. So we see that you can't get out of this. You can't say I'm dictating into this machine and I'm putting letters on a screen on Shabbat. I'm not doing anything. The Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch and Rav Moshe in his responses say you can't get off the hook. Your voice, when it causes actions to occur, if it's prohibited, you've committed a sin. Now, so when you talk about an electric dictating machine, first you have to talk about what is the nature of the prohibition of closing an electric circuit on Shabbat. And there are 4 different opinions. I mean, I'm sure there are more, but of the great poskim that we draw our wisdom from over the last 100 or more years, who discuss electricity, there are about 4 different opinions. Anybody want to venture a guess? These are well-known, let's say, theoretical ideas about what the prohibition of electricity is. Bona, there you go. So that's number 1. That's very good. The Chazon Ish, we have the Chazon Ish in our library, in Orach Chaim Nun Siman Katan Tet. It might be worth reading his words. Od yesh b'zeh makom tikun mana. He's talking about what happens when you close an electric circuit. So he says, Od yesh b'zeh mishum tikun. Tikun mana means you're correcting or making a certain object. Kevin shemamido al tchunato. It makes that thing into what it's supposed to be, I guess, into what it's planned to be. Lizrom et zerem hachashmal bitminut, to get the electricity flowing all the time. He says, "V'karov hadavar d'zeh bonem min haTorah." He says he sees that as building. In other words, you had a circuit, it was broken. In other words, the switch was open. You closed the circuit. Now you've built a circuit. Before you didn't. You had a broken circuit. Now you have a built circuit. Now, one of the problems, and you're doing that on Shabbat. Bona, to build on Shabbat is usher. One of the problems with that approach is that usually we say ein binyan b'kelim. If you have a utensil, we don't consider it binyan. We don't consider it building. But if something is attached to the ground, then it's already, that comes under the concept of binyan. So he says that the kosh ken kan shekol achutim b'chubarim l'bayit. He says the electric wires are all connected to the house, and the house is connected to the ground. So now you have a something that's not a keli because it's connected to the ground. There's an isser here of binyan. So this was not. So I don't know if any of you have ever read any of the letters that Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach wrote back and forth to the Chazon Ish. I have it at home in a little booklet. Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, at the time the Chazon Ish came out with his psak, he was a young guy. I think he was in his 20s. But when you read what he wrote, and his kind of understanding of electricity was really exceptional. And he wrote with great respect to the Chazon Ish that he didn't see it. Like, in other words, explain it to me. I don't understand what you're saying. And he had his points. And the Chazon Ish sent him a letter, and he sent him back a letter. And went back and forth and back and forth. The Chazon Ish stuck to his position, but Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, his final psak was that it is not bona. And we'll talk in a second what he thought it was. He didn't think it was construction. He thought it was usage. He said, you're not really constructing a circuit. It's like you're using, it's not like you're making a utensil. That's how you use a utensil. And there's no isser in using a utensil on Shabbos. Anyhow, but that's one point of view. That is bona, that's building. Then there was a great rabbi named Rav Yitzchak Shmelkes. This is on page 2, source number 2. And he wrote, he was known as the Beit Yitzchak. That was his books that he wrote. And he ruled, his classic ruling, and I think he was in the end of the 19th century, maybe early 20th century. I think he preceded the Chazon Ish, and what was the Chazon Ish was in the 1930s, the 1940s, 1950s. Rosh Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, these are all great, I should say Zecher Tzadik Livracha, they're all great tzaddikim. He passed on in the latter half of the 20th century. But the Rav Yitzchak Shmelkes, he goes back before all of them, and he concluded that the isser was molid. That when you close a circuit, molid means creating something new, right? If you strike a match and you create a fire on the piece of wood, that's molid. That's why we can't strike a match on Yom Tov. We can transfer fire, but we can't initiate fire. Let's put it that way. The classic example in the Gemara is to take clothes and put them on a kind of spicy fragrance, and that makes the clothes smell nicely, and you're molid of kind of a smell in the clothing. This is the Gemara's example. So he says this is kind of the same thing, right? You're closing the circuit, and you're creating something new called an electric current. All of a sudden, you close the circuit is open, you touch the thing, nothing happens. You close the circuit, you touch it, you get a shock. Why? There's these electrodes going around and round and round in the circuit. That's molid, you're building something new. Okay. Now, according to the Chazon Ish, the Isser is from the Torah. Bona, building on Shabbos, is prohibited from the Torah. Molid is only prohibited from rabbinically. So this takes it down a step and has certain implications. Then there's the modern posek of our generation, I think. Well, there are others, but he's certainly there at the top, Rav Asher Weiss. He held that he felt that it is prohibited. It's prohibited from the Torah, and the prohibition is makeh b'patish. Makeh b'patish literally means hitting something with a hammer, or right? But that's not really what it means. In other words, the isra of makeh b'patish, as discussed in the Gemara, is finishing off an object. So when an artisan made something, at the end of the process, he give it a clap, and you know it was over. So anything you do that sort of finishes off an object, that's makeh b'pashit. That's also a Torah prohibition. And Rav Asher Weiss felt that was the issur of electricity. Now, I don't have a lot of his details. I don't have a lot of details in my sources for any of them. But presumably he meant that that you build an electric appliance or an electric motor, whatever it is. How do you finish it off? How do you close it? That's the end of the now you finish building whatever you're not building, but making whatever you're making. So he felt it was also prohibited from the Torah makeh b'patish. Then there's Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. This is a source 4. And he talks about that he first, I brought his source 4 and 5 are both from Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. And he goes through the Chazon Ish and the Beit Yitzchak, and he rejects both their conclusions. The Chazon Ish I told you about already. What does he say? Let's read source 4, Daled. Muvar al kol panim dechavanat hachazon ishi, etc., etc. V'yesh kan tikun surah lehekshem. You're changing the surah, the form of the thing to something lehekshem. You give it body of some sort. It's like building. V'lachein chashi bona. He says ube'enai lo yadati amay kari le tikun surah. He doesn't feel that building, that there's any making a new form or shape here. Nir la'ani adati, from my eye, says the Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach, the yesh lirot et achut asher azerem over darko kezerem shel gaz or ruach ha'over. He says the electricity, when you close a circuit, you're not building anything. He says it's like a pipe. If you have a pipe in your house and you run some substance through that pipe, that's not building. So he says by closing the circuit, all you're doing is moving material through a wire. It's not building. He says it's using it. You're using the wire. You're not building it. That was his perspective. And then he says, he looks at, I brought number 5 because it relates to Rav Asher Weiss's conclusion. Nitbar lefi zed la'ani adati nired b'kai gavna delo asa klal shum hadlako kibu ikim chaber rak telephone mazram. So this is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach talking about a telephone. So now we're talking about what the prohibition is of electricity. We're talking about closing the circuit. Let's remember also, we're talking only about closing the circuit. If the circuit is connected, let's say, to an electric light, then most of the poskim feel certain kind, especially the light bulbs at their time, you were creating a fire. So that's another story. Whether there's any prohibition in creating electricity might be one question, but as soon as you attach it to an electric light bulb and you create a fire, that's another question. So that is a Torah prohibition. So really the discussion of whether electricity is permitted or not, we're talking about situations where there's no lights being put on, okay? But he's talking in the telephone. I guess there weren't any lights in the telephone. All you were doing when you're using the telephone is you were creating an electric circuit. So he said, as long as you're not putting on any lights with your telephone, he said, I don't see, he's already said he doesn't think it's building. He says it's not makeh b'patish like Rav Asher Weiss says, and he gave his reasons for that. And he says you're not creating something new. I think what he argued was what do you mean you're creating some new electrons going around the circuit? The electrons are there already. You're just moving them around like the gas or the material, or whatever you're moving around. You're not creating a new electrode. But in the end, he comes to the conclusion, Achma eser, what can I do? Shekvar hora sakein v'hu agon moreno harav Yitzchak Shmelkish, Zichron Avracha b'Shela v'Tshuvat Beit Yitzchak. He goes back to the Rav Yitzchak Shmelkish, who was the first one who decided on this more than 100 years ago, and he says we have to go with what he said. If I'm rejecting the Chazon Ish, I'm rejecting, or the reason, he's not rejecting the Chazon Ish, he rejects the reason of the Chazon Ish, rejects the reason of Rav Asher Weiss. He says, but who was the first one here? It was the Beit Yitzchak. He said it was rabbinically prohibited, and he said it was because of Molid. I'm not going to go contradict this ancient sage. And the Asr Mishum, the Molid Recha, he said it's like you're creating something new. The Asr Lasot elektrische Verbindung b'Shabbos. I think he means electric circuits. That's what it is in Yiddish. Anyhow, so the authors here also say that the normative opinion seems to be today. Although if you're in Rav Asher Weiss's camp, you're not going to say this. But the normative opinion about many rabbis in the world is closing electric circuit is rabbinically prohibited. It's bishum molid, but still it's prohibited. Okay, now let's talk. So that's background. Okay, we got a little time left. Let's talk about a smart speaker. And what I'm really going to try to do here is compare a smart speaker to a keyboard in terms of creating words and letters and words and sentences on a screen. So the question I'm going to put to you: if one is forced in an emergency medical report, or if one is forced to record an emergency, well, I said, if one is forced to record an emergency medical report onto a computer screen on Shabbat, which is preferable? A voice smart speaker dictation or typing? And it doesn't just have to be a doctor. Let's say, let's say you're a nurse in a remote community, and there no doctors get out to, Sioux Lookout. But on Shabbat, we have critically ill patients, and you have a doctor centrally, at Mount Sinai Hospital, and you have to send them a report on each patient. You're not using phones, you're not using videos, you just send a report. Is it better for that nurse on Shabbat, if she's Shomer Shabbat, or Shomeret Shabbat, or a man, Shomer Shabbat could be a nurse, to speak into that her smart speaker dictation machine, such that what she's saying is recorded on a screen centrally in Mount Sinai? Or should she sit there and type out every word and every letter like you do with an email? So why would there be a difference? So for this, if you look on page 3, again, source number 1, even in emergency situations, we try as hard as we can to reduce the number of Shabbat violations that we perform. Meaning, if I want to get someone to the emergency department, everything else being equal, if there'll be no delays and no deterioration of the patient's health, I should look at getting that patient, that sick patient, to the hospital, performing the least number of violations, assuming that there's no delay. If it's going to delay things, that's a different story. In other words, if you're going to call a non-Jewish person to do it for you, but it's going to take him 15 minutes to get there, nothing doing. You put him in your back of your truck or your ambulance, and you take him wherever he has to go, and you drive yourself. But if there's a non-Jewish person in the room, sure, it's better to get him to drive the ambulance, right? You're reducing the prohibitions. You're not performing it, you're just telling a non-Jew to do it. And this is also true if you yourself are doing it, and you can do it by violating less Shabbat prohibitions. Look at the Gemara, or look at this is the Shulchan Aruch, Orach Chaim's, but it's quoting for the Gemara. Amduhu l'shtei grogrot. There was a very sick person. This, of course, is a model. It's a very sick person, and the doctor said he had to have 2 grogrot, 2 dates every day. That's going to save him. And they went out to or 2 figs. I don't know. This must be a fig, I think. And they go out to the fig tree, and they found that they had 2 different branches. Each one had a fig on it. Then there was a 3rd branch, and it had 3 figs on it. Which branches do you cut? You need 2 figs. Branch 1, 1 fig. Branch 2, 1 fig. Branch 3, 3 figs. If you cut branch 3, you're getting 3 figs. You don't need that. You only need 2. So do you cut the 2 branches with 1 fig on each, or do you cut the branch with 3 figs on each? Answer is you cut the branch with 3 figs on it. Because cutting a branch with 3 figs, even though you bring down from the tree an extra fig you don't need, but you've only done 1 prohibition, you've done only 1 cutting. Whereas if you take 2 branches, each with 1 on them, okay, now you have the number of figs you want, but you cut 2 branches. So they say, if he only 2 figs on 2 separate branches, but you had another branch with 3 figs, Kortin ha'oketz sheyesh bo gimel. You cut the branch that has 3 on it, and so on and so forth.
What do you do with the 3rd fig?
You could look, you can put it on the table, right? The question whether I can eat it or not is a good question. I think the Gemara and the Shulchan Aruch discusses that. Once it's been done, beheter. What's that?
You'd have to wait till she asks after Shabbat.
Yeah, right. The question is, what if you're boiling? It's the same question. Let's say a person has to have hot food on Shabbos. You take a pot of chicken, you make a bunch of chicken for the sick person, and there's some chicken left over in the pot. Are you allowed to eat it? And you're not sick, so there's discussion on it. But it's not, I think, completely prohibited. But like you say, you have to wait till after Shabbos. And here's a rabbi, so he knows what he's talking about. Okay, so I assume rabbis know what they're talking about. Okay, so basically, you want to. So if opening and closing a circuit of electricity is a prohibited act, then what you're going to do on Shabbat to get your dictation onto the screen, you would like to do the least number of prohibited acts to get your dictation on the screen. Now, to continue with the shiur, you have to understand a little bit about smartphone dictation, which is a problem because I don't understand anything about smartphone dictation. However, they give a pretty good description here, which I can kind of explain it as I understand it. There's something in modern electric machines, there's something called microcircuits. We know what a macro circuit is. Macro circuit is, we have a wire going to that light around the room. Here I go to if I pull out that switch there, you'll see there's two wires, we put them together, we create a circuit, you can see it. There are millions of microcircuits in today's machines. For example, someone has a hearing aid. Generally speaking, the rabbis allow people to use a hearing aid. Now, in modern day hearing aids, there is a mechanism in the hearing aid to screen out background noise. If you move from a quiet room to a room where there's a lot of noise, that hearing aid will activate multiple millions of microcircuits to screen out the noise. And when you move back, it'll go in the other direction. So the rabbis allow someone to use a hearing aid on Shabbat. That's a whole discussion. Why? Does that mean I have to sit in a quiet room the whole time? Am I allowed to move from room A to room B? Even though I know many microcircuits are going to be closed. If every one of those microcircuits is a prohibition on Shabbat, like the four opinions we have, either rabbinic or Torah prohibition, so just stay in the room where it's quiet. Person is on call. The rabbis allow a doctor on calls for cardiovascular surgery. There you've got an emergency doctor on call, right? Or for the emergency department, whatever. To carry a cell phone on Shabbat. When if I move this cell phone from here to the chuppah garden outside, changes occur in my cell phone. Because when you move your geographic position, there are changes that occur in your cell phone. Your cell phone is monitoring your position and so on. Does a doctor on call have to put his cell phone on a table here and sit with the cell phone all Shabbos by the table? Or could he put it in his pocket and walk to shul and go out for a walk with his wife? But every time he moves, he's activating microcircuits. Is that permissible or not permissible? So you see where, sure, you're allowed to do something for pikuach nefesh to save lives, but you don't have to go out for a walk with your wife or even to go to shul. You can stay home and daven on your own, right? So there are many things we don't see that occur in our devices today. So there is a very important tshuva from Rav Asher Weiss. It's on page 3, opening and closing microcircuits. It says, right? And he argues, and I'll read it, he argues that opening and closing microcircuits is not prohibited on Shabbos. He tells you himself that closing a macro circuit, closing a circuit on an electric machine it's makepapatish, he says, right? But if I have, let's say a dictation machine, I open up the dictation machine, okay, that's prohibited, right? But if the circuit that I open when I speak creates millions of other microcircuits that are opening and closing, they are not prohibited on Shabbos. It's only the initial circuit that you open. And of course, the result is the same. If keyboarding, you have the same result. You have the same number of letters on the screen. So if you think that's writing, it's writing whether you dictate it with your voice or if you type it. But what happens between when I start talking and what happens on the screen, if it involves, again, these microcircuits, even if there's millions of them, he argues it's not prohibited on Shabbos. You want to ask a question?
Well, they're two different actions. One action is force.
Is which?
The other, one action is force
Force?
on the keyboard,
Okay.
and the other one is sound on a voice dictation.
So
And
that's-
with that foundation, is there a difference?
So that's,
I was gonna say, you beat me to it, but I mean, speaking is lashin b'masa, right? I'm speaking.
so
Typing
listen,
is an
but
action.
you missed the first part, right? So the first part, remember I talked about muzzling the ox. That's why I brought in the first part. Is speaking an action, a force? If I
Because it causes.
If I force my ox not to eat something on the ground just by yelling at him, is that the same as me as grabbing him or putting a muzzle on him? Says Rav Yochanan and Reish Lakish, it's asur. They agree. Reish Lakish says there's no masa. Rav Yochanan says there is a masa. And the Tosfot explains it. He says that if you use your voice and it creates a visible action, that's the same as a masa. And the Shulchan Aruch seems to paskin that way. So your point is well taken. That's why I brought this thing at the beginning, that voice activity that causes an action is no different in terms of being prohibited than banging on a keyboard.
And you wouldn't say that is, even if you go with Rabbi Yochanan, you wouldn't say it's a grama versus a direct action?
Well, you could all argue everything's a grama. Well, if I press on the keyboard, I'm not writing on the screen. So I press on the keyboard and something shows up over there, and that's some kind of, I mean, grama, of course, you know, is very complicated sugya, but certainly it's not direct. So why is it any different than me speaking and it ends up on the screen? I know what you're saying, but that's why. And Rav Moshe said, he said, if you do an action, that was one of the things that Rav Moshe said. Shadibur im yesh mechona kazu shebedibur naseh melacha al yedei mechona asur la'asot zeh b'Shabbat. You cannot, on Shabbos, use an electric machine that is activated by your voice. I think he meant the microphone. That's what he's talking about. So, again, nobody would be discussing it if it wasn't a point well taken, but that seems to be the conclusion, that's not a difference between the two. Good, okay. But he says something else. He says, he starts, there's a concept, there's some kind of violation of Shabbat by closing an electric circuit. Imalachet Bona, the Chazon Ish says, is building. Imalachet Makeba Patish, like Rav Asher Weiss said, that's what I said. It's like finishing off an object. He doesn't mention Moli, but then here comes the clincher. Omnan nired ein ze ela biskirat magal chashmali sheyesh ba to'elet v'totza'a gluya hanireit la'inayim. That is only true. Closing an electric circuit, he says, is asur. Now his words are a little difficult. It has a meaning, it has an outcome that is gluya, that is clear, and you can see it with your own eyes. You can see me closing that light switch, but you cannot, when you walk with your hearing aid outside, see these. We're talking about 1 million microcircuits that are opening and closing for a millisecond at a time. That's how voice dictation works. And the same thing happens, I think, with modern typing as well. There are more microcircuits, I think, with voice dictation.
Is there a difference between macro and micro in terms of, I don't understand any of that stuff, but is there a difference? Obviously, and what does Somet say about all this stuff? Somebody who understands.
By the way, Somet does get involved with this. He discusses Somet, right?
Especially for Rabushers, for Somet.
Yeah. So they talk about the wheelchair for Somet that has to be on all the time because they don't want to see changes in current and whatever. But he's not talking about the wheelchair. I agree that wheelchair is a discussion and probably along the same line. What's the difference between macro and micro? Macro is I turn on my computer, I turn on my cell phone, the little flash goes on and everything else. Micro is what happens to my cell phone when I take it and I walk outside.
So what difference,
So he says, what's the difference? You cannot see it, You can, it's micro. You can't see it, and it occurs for milliseconds. That seems to come out from
You
his.
don't have to initiate it for it to happen.
You indirectly initiate it.
The micro and macro, the difference is one is a direct cause and effect. The other one is more.
He doesn't say that, by the way, but I get it. I get it, but he doesn't say that. He says the big difference between micro and macro is micro occurs for a millisecond. It opens and closes, no one sees it, and no one knows what it's doing. When I read, by the way, that my cell phone, idiot that I am, that my cell phone has all these microcircuits going on and off when I walk on the street with it, I didn't know that. I learned something new, right?
The phrasing that I think he uses here is Shabbat, right? You're doing that, there's no intent of, I'm moving here and I'm turning on these things.
I think you're right. You're right. So first we sell sheyesh, it should be not bat to elet v'totza'a gluya hanireit leinayim. You don't see it, you don't feel it, you don't know you're doing it. And he says it's very aval matzui od she'adam mafil marachot elektroniyot shonot. A person activates different electric systems. She'ein to'alotam v'totza'otan gluya. It's not obvious to the naked eye, to the observer of the street, or even the observer using the machine. And he says, like you said, "B'chol eila ani atati ein srach malacha." Says there's no malacha here. Ve'ein bahem malachet machshevet. Malachet machshevet. How do you explain that? Malachet machshevet is a malacha that you have to have. It's not quite intent because that's kavanah, but machshevet you have to have thought in it. It's close, but machshevet you have to have your brain in it. Your brain isn't into the microcircuits on these machines. That's what he says. Let's go to page 4.
So,
you can, by the way.
Thank you. So I'm just looking at the English translation.
Go ahead.
Of,
by the way, this is
of not being.
These are my English translations.
Oh, okay. No, but based on your English translation, though, it says electronic microcircuits are not apparent to the observer. But being apparent to the observer means more than simply seeing what is happening. So you may not see what is happening, but it is quite apparent to you that it is happening.
But it's true. You know that something is happening. You're talking into the machine, and letters are being projected on a screen. But you don't know about the microcircuits. If I didn't explain to you now about the microcircuits, maybe you're a computer geek and you know about it. But
let's say you do know about the microcircuits. Let's say you do know all about those circuits. You don't see what's happening, but you are very much aware. Would that
the fact that you're a scientist and that you know that it's happening, that's not what he means by aware, I don't think. He means aware to the average person, to the naked eye. That's what I think he means. Right? The fact that someone tells me that, okay, so now, that it's still a microcircuit that is not, those are the words in Hebrew. Ein batwelt v'totza gluya hanireit leinayim. He says, your eyes don't see it. Right? All right. So, but by the way, you should know, I read this many times before I got a feeling for it, because all the questions that you're asking, it's a little bit hard to get my hands on them, as I get my mind around it, but I think I'm beginning to get it. In other words, right? It's not a question that Rav Asher Weiss is wrong. I don't understand what he's doing, but thick as I am, after a period of time, I began to get it. Then he goes over each one of the types of electric. What were the reasons that electricity is prohibited on Shabbat? So he takes each one and he negates them as a cause of being involved in microcircuits. That microcircuits do not involve boneh. Microcircuits do not involve molid. Microcircuits do not involve makeba patish, and he explains them. And this is also not so easy. Imitzad geter molid nireh barur derakish molid davar chadash shaha'ayin ro'eh v'halev chomed. What's the thing in the Gemara? You take a piece of clothing, you put it on fragrance, on spices that give fragrance to so that's something, that's molid. You put new fragrance into the coat. You want the fragrance, you can smell the fragrance. Can anybody sense microcircuits? Can you sense the microcircuits that are occurring in my computer right now as I record it? Right? He says you have to either see it or feel it. That's molid. Aval b'shinuyim electronim in electric changes she'ein bahem totza'ah chashuva nira la'ayin. You don't see the microcircuits. Upulat hamachshir nimshechet ki'ilu me'eleha, and you think the machine, like my cell phone, seems to be working on its own. I don't see microcircuits going on when I move the room, when I move to another room. He says ein b'zeh geter molid klal. So he takes from he says I could accept the Beit Yitzchak's approach that it's molid, but the definition of molid is not in microcircuits. Then he says. Building as well. You go home and tell your wife, I built something for you. I built a kitchen table. So she goes out and she sees a kitchen table there. It lasts. It's sitting there. She sees it, right? Magalim hazirim is the Hebrew for microcircuits. Zi'urim remains small. Hamitchabrim umitparkim bechelkikei shniyot. They come together. They connect. And they open and close in fractions of a second. The ein bahem kol nafkamina v'totzah chashuva v'nikeret. There's no nafkamina, there's no result or consequence that is important that you can recognize. I think he says ein dedom lebona klal. You tell your wife you're building her a house, you could come and show her the house, and she can walk inside. What is this here? What are these microcircuits? What are you building here? They open, they close, there's a second, and so on. Where's the building? He says. And then he says, even for myself, I said that it's usher to close a circuit because you're finishing off the thing. He says, this thing happens like kind of automatically. Like I'm not closing a switch. These switches are opening and closing. It looks like they're doing them on their own. There's no lasting future to this. They don't exist in the long run. So he says that's not makeba patish. Makeba patish. You come and you hit the object with a hammer. I finished it. Here it is. Here's the object. There's nothing here. The shani makeba patish mishar hamlachot v'kol she'ein bo Kavana v'tachlit ein bo geder malacha klal. He says a makeba patish, finishing an object, there has to be some consequence, something of that you try to finish off an object. Here's the object. So he said. So what these authors say, this is kind of the brilliant conclusion. What the authors say is, although a dictating machine has many, many more opening and closing of microcircuits than does hitting a computer key, because it's new technology, it has to listen to your voice, it has to assess your voice, it has to compare your voice. It's really, really complicated technology. Millions of microcircuits, much more than computer typing. It doesn't matter. You can't say that you're doing more prohibitions with the dictating machine, because the more prohibitions you're doing are microcircuits, and microcircuits are not more prohibitions. So essentially, they're even on that level. I do something, I type and I create something on the screen, or I talk and I create something in the screen. What happens between the typing or the talking and what goes on the screen, all those microcircuits, there's nothing to compare there in terms of how many prohibitions are you doing, comparing the prohibitions in a case of pikuach nefesh.
Something like disabling the screen, is that helpful in terms of knocking it down a level?
So that's what to do about computer screens is a big discussion, because a lot of people feel that computer screens is writing. I'm not a rabbi, but computer screens, a lot of people think it isn't. It's not. Computer screens is not. You're not making a number 2 or a letter B. You've got these little dots on the screen, right? And then you close off the computer, the dots are gone. Is that writing? Some people think yes. Some people say no. The point is, if it's an emergency situation, you're dictating the note, and it's going to be of some value, someone has to turn on the screen, right? Eventually, even if, when you're doing it, if the screen is off, eventually the screen has to be turned on, right? Otherwise, why are you doing it? So you're trying to let other doctors know what's going on so they can take steps to save the person's life. So the last point, he says that keyboarding has more violations than dictation. Why? When you keyboard a message onto a screen and you say this patient, you keyboard THIS, patient PATIENT. That's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Each time you hit it to the keyboard. Each time you're doing it, you're doing the macro circuit. You're with the dictating machine. You dictate a word. So if I say this, the computer doesn't divide it up to THIS. It's one word. So you've got one sort of what's called macro circuit versus 4 macro circuits every time you hit the keyboard. Furthermore, you could do even better. You could say a whole sentence. This patient presented to the emergency department with chest pain, right? That would be what, 50 letters, 50 malachot by keyboarding. The dictation machine will take that as one sentence and put it on the screen as one sentence. So it's one initiation of electricity versus 50 initiations of electricity. They want to argue that a person who's working in Pikuach Nefesh in emergency departments, and it's very important, by the way, to make records, very, very important. People should not dispense with that. I know I've worked in that situation. They should do it with a dictating machine. There will be less violation of Shabbat prohibitions with a dictating machine versus a keyboard. Now I don't think they have, I don't know who is the decider today, who is the one who's the posek ador, but they put this out there. They're both very, very smart people, and they understand both the technology side of it and the Torah side of it, and it's a very interesting suggestion that we should be providing, our emergency physicians in Israel or in Canada with who have to produce records with a dictating machine rather than a keyboard.
Is that Summit?
This is not a Summit thing. This is not a Summit thing. They don't quote Summit. Whether Summit would accept this, the Summit is going to use what Rabbi Asher Weiss said. If Rabbi Asher Weiss said that microcircuits are not usher and can be used in emergency situations without doing an issue, they're going to. There's certain. Oh, by the way, I have to stay cut. Do we have 10 people?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry.